My name is Miles Brundage, and I'm a research scientist at the company OpenAI, and I work on the policy team there. So I'm interested in what companies and governments and individuals should do in order to make sure that the benefits of AI accrue to everyone and we manage the biggest risks. So I think that there are lots of challenges to privacy that are happening simultaneously. So people are starting to use services that are tracking and generating huge amounts of data about individual decisions and sort of human behavior at the individual and group level. And AI sort of makes it possible to analyze that data in a more scalable way than if you had to have sort of one person assigned to, spying on this person or designing the perfect ad for this person. If you do that with AI, and specifically machine learning and deep learning instead, that allows you to sort of get the benefits of personalization and customization in terms of any sort of large-scale influence campaign. And I think that's both exciting because sort of the scalability of AI is what makes possible all of these benefits, the ability to sort of do customization and personalization at scale, but it also raises lots of questions about how we can make sure that people's data is not sort of manipulated or analyzed in a way that is sort of discriminatory or biased in various ways. So I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening right now at trying to sort of alleviate trade-offs between privacy and other desirable things like the performance of an AI system. So there's things like federated learning, where you share gradients rather than the data across multiple devices, and you can sort of train a more powerful model while still protecting privacy at the individual device level. There are other things like secure multi-party computation and the approaches that are being pursued by the organization OpenMind, I think, are very exciting. There's things like differential privacy and sort of, there's a flowering of all sorts of conceptual frameworks and tools and so forth for sort of getting the benefits of deep learning while minimizing or at least sort of quantifying the risks to privacy. So I think that's really exciting, but there's likely to be some sort of trade-off in terms of computational overhead or sort of communications overhead in order to do these sort of fancy cryptographic and other means of protecting privacy. So I think there's a serious question to be asked about, what are realistic standards for private machine learning and sort of privacy protecting approaches to data analysis in general, and should they be legislated? Should it depend on sort of the sensitivity of the data? When are we willing to pay the extra costs in terms of convenience or computing overhead in order to have greater privacy protection? So I think we're still in the early stages of figuring that out, but I think there's a lot of technical progress which is helping us think these things through and sort of make more fine-grained decisions. And also, the regulatory landscape is changing rapidly with GDPR in Europe and other countries thinking about these sorts of issues. So I'd say there's a lot of flowers blooming currently in terms of the intersection of AI and privacy. So I mentioned earlier that there's sort of potentially malicious uses of AI that are invasive of privacy or sort of used for surveillance and potentially oppressing individuals. But I think there's also a lot of positive potential, and I think the fact that data can be produced in a cheap way is one of the most exciting properties of AI. There's no reason why code and data has to be locked up with any particular individual. It's something that can be produced or reproduced very cheaply. So I think there's a lot of potential for sort of public creation and sort of crowdsourced creation of large data sets, as well as governments funding the creation of large data sets as a sort of public good to the research community and industry to sort of move these things forward and have it not be sort of siloed data across companies. So that's one thing that I'm very interested in, is sort of data access as a policy problem. Another sort of angle is around the connection between intellectual property laws and privacy and then data. So for example, there might be limitations on your ability to look at all of the books on Google Books, for example. So Google has scanned a huge number of books, but for legal reasons, they can't just give everyone access to both the actual text and the images of these millions of books. So things like that, sort of locking up of data for legal reasons potentially has various implications for what sorts of AI technologies actually end up being developed. So, for example, there's a researcher named Amanda Lewandowski who has sort of documented the impact of intellectual property protections on sort of the bias in certain data sets, for example. So, if we are sort of limited in what data we're able to obtain, then sometimes, that what remains might be sort of different from the distribution of data in general. So she gives the example of the Enron data sets, which is, basically a bunch of white men talking to each other by email, but it's used as this sort of large-scale data set for natural language processing. So things like that sort of are at the intersection of intellectual property and policy and sort of bias, and I think it's something that we need to think down the road about how we want to move forward. I think that's a really interesting question, and some colleagues of mine and I wrote a report last year on the malicious use of AI and sort of looked at various ways in which you could use AI for harmful purposes, and I think that sort of points to the sort of dual-edged sword nature of AI, that it's the scalability and the competence that you're sort of combining in these systems, the ability to do tasks that you either couldn't do before or you couldn't previously do them before at scale is very exciting, but that's also potentially exciting to people who are wishing to steal people's money or launch a war and so forth. So I think that's potentially very scary. But there's a lot of things to be optimistic about in terms of the technical approaches that are being pushed forward and the ways in which we can sort of balance these technologies from a privacy perspective. But then are there cases where we shouldn't publish sort of publish the code or publish the data at all? So there's already some limitations on that due to intellectual property and sort of competitive reasons or security reasons. So you might not want to reveal exactly how your commercial, face recognition system or sort of video understanding system works, because then people could spoof it or then people could steal it. So there are sort of legitimate reasons for not publishing everything in AI. And I think it's sort of important to distinguish different motivations for why you might not publish things. So that's one class of motivations. Another class of motivations might be sort of similar to how in cybersecurity people wait a little bit of time before they publish something because they want to give people a chance to react when they found a new problem or a new vulnerability. I think that's something we might want to think about as a possible model in AI. Say, for example, if we found a new way to break a video understanding system with adversarial examples, then you might want to give a heads up to the company that's using this in driverless cars before you post the paper on arXiv. So I think just being generally reasonable and responsible and what we say and do in what order, I think is something to consider, especially as these technologies get more widely used in practice. Then there are more stakeholders who you might want to sort of give a heads up, even if it's just a few days notice or something. So that's something that we're thinking through at OpenAI, and other companies are sort of very interested in, because they're seeing things like deepfakes where there's sort of both legitimate and sort of creepy or even illegal or harmful uses of these technologies. So I think there's sort of this ongoing sort of arms race, to risk overusing that term, between efforts to sort of get the benefits of privacy-preserving technologies while still maintaining performance, and then there are sort of the non-privacy preserving techniques which are continuing to move forward. So there's always a bit of lag because someone invents a convolutional neural network in the 90s, and that wasn't necessarily obvious at the time how that would fit into homomorphic encryption or something. So it takes time for people to think about how to sort of make existing algorithms more secure, as well as come up with more efficient things, more efficient techniques for encryption and other sorts of privacy protection mechanisms. But I think we're going to see the trade-off continue to go down over time. So I think it's already the case you can get very competitive performance with differential privacy and federated learning and so forth. The question is, are there cases where you're willing to accept some trade-off, either because you want your system to be more interpretable or you want to be more privacy protecting? I think, depending on the situation, there might be cases where you're willing to accept some trade-off like that. Sure. So people have defined privacy in various ways, and it sort of varies across cultures and even within cultures and over time. But to me, it's something like the ability to control information about your life and other people's access to that information. So that can be sort of grounded in physical terms like physical privacy, or it could nowadays have to do with digital privacy, because in a very meaningful sense, the data on your phone is an extension of you. And that can be a violation of your privacy if that data is compromised. So I think there are sort of multiple domains and spheres of privacy, but the general idea and sort of theory behind it in my mind is that people need to have some sort of sphere and protection from critical eyes and sort of social pressure in order to develop a good sense of self and sort of to be able to question social norms that might become ossified over time. Yeah, so I think there are definitely cultural differences around privacy, though I think, in many respects, the differences within sort of Western countries and across Western countries can be, just as big as between Western and non-Western countries. So even just within the US, there's sort of, people who, due to lack of education or wealth or just time because they're, working multiple jobs and have kids and don't have time to worry about this stuff, are sort of in an underclass with respect to privacy, whereas there are richer people who are more tech savvy and sort of can afford to buy the latest iPhones and always have everything updated and use Signal and two-factor authentication and so forth, and sort of have the bandwidth and energy to invest in those sorts of things. So I think privacy is something that is valued and sort of acted on to different extents based on people's knowledge and their ability to actually do it. But I think there's some commonality of I'm not sure I'd call it human nature, but there's definitely a fairly universal trend of people, when they're able to sort of protect their privacy, when they have the bandwidth to sort of stand up, and the political situation is such that they're able to resist where appropriate and try and fight for their privacy. I think that's a pretty common trend. But if you compare, say, the EU to the US, or the US to the UK, or China to Japan, you'll find all sorts of differences. I personally do. In the sense that it's sort of a necessary. I'm not sure what my views are on its sort of intrinsic value per se. Like, I think I could imagine a world of future humans who don't care about privacy, but I think for humans as they are today, in a world in which we don't think we figured out all of society's biggest questions, and we think that there's a need for continuing sort of innovation and free thinking over time, I think it's important to have some space for people to do that. Yeah, I think there are multiple reasons why you might want privacy. I think there's sort of the democratic argument of you want people to sort of form their opinions and not be subject to herd mentality, and you want sort of a bunch of independent voters coming to opinions and arriving at the truth, and for a sufficiently large population of independent voters that should converge on the truth. But that all gets screwed up if there's pressure to sort of conform to the societal opinion from like a democratic theory perspective. You can also ground it in sort of autonomy and liberty and sort of the ability to think freely and so forth. So I think there are like multiple motivations. So it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where you could say, well, because people are represented in government, therefore they shouldn't worry about privacy. I think sort of the robustness of representative government depends in part on the ability of people to have their opinions be developed freely. Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, definitely at the extremes of the spectrum of sort of, plain text, being sent over the internet with no encryption on the one end and like fully homomorphic encryption on the other end. One is clearly more able to keep secrets and sort of, plan criminal conspiracies and do other bad things than the others. But correlated with that is the greater ability to protect, secrets from an oppressive government and so forth. So I think there's an interesting question of sort of, is a world with much stronger encryption and privacy on net good, even if there's going to be some misuse, similar to how things like Bitcoin have been misused and have allowed sort of secrecy and criminal enterprises to run amok. I think it's possible that we'll just have to sort of bite the bullet on that sort of trade-off. But I think it's also possible that we can sort of push the frontier of both of these simultaneously. So sort of privacy and security and transparency with technical advances. So things like secure multi-party computation can potentially allow you to sort of do an evaluation of an AI system and learn some properties of it in a black box fashion, but without being able to steal the weights of the model. So I think insofar as technologies like that get cheap and easy to do, or we can like build a strong case for it, then we might be able to have our cake and eat it too. Amanda Lewandowski's research on sort of IP and how that influences the distribution of data sets is really interesting. And I think it sort of points to larger questions. So basically her point is that because of IP, there's sort of limitations on what people can produce freely as a tool for the AI community. And I think more generally, there are lots of ways in which governments can open up government data sets from sort of things that they're already doing, as well as creating new public data sets as a resource to either the whole world or to certain subsets of the AI community. I think in terms of how important this is, I think it's super important to think about what are the sort of key ingredients of AI progress and sort of AI benefiting society. And I think that can be broken down into a few things that governments should be thinking about. So there's sort of talent and academia and investment and that sort of stuff. There's scaling and sort of economic impact, and for that you want things like frameworks and large amounts of compute. And then sort of more on the research end of the spectrum, there's things like data sets, and public data sets can definitely be an accelerant to the academic community and industry and sort of help level the playing field and reduce barriers to entry in the AI market. So it's definitely something that should be considered as part of this sort of broader lens on what, if anything, should we do to accelerate the deployment of AI. Storing and controlling are sort of somewhat different questions in terms of, if you ask whether people can or should store and control their data. I think with so many things moving to the cloud, I think we should hope that we can sort of decouple, having it on your own personal device from having effective control over something in the cloud. And I think that raises questions around, cloud security and general information security questions about how to do that. And there are various sort of efforts to robustify cloud data and processing services so that it's more like a personal computer you have at home. But I think in terms of scale, it's probably unlikely that people will either want or be able to keep all of their data on their iPhone or smartwatch or whatever. Maybe on one device, but probably not on all their devices. I think if current trends towards sort of cloud centrism continue. First of all, I should be clear that I think that people should be able to control their data. The question is whether that means sort of should they personally be responsible for having a backup USB drive, or does that mean that they should be able to say, hey Google, delete this, or sort of have like control over their cloud services in that sort of way. So I think GDPR moved us somewhat towards that direction of sort of the ability to control your data, but it's being sort of stored externally. More generally, there are all sorts of ideas for sort of doing things on blockchains and sort of data trusts and other models. I'm not sure that I'm sold on any particular solution, but I think it's these are all models that we should be considering, especially if there are cases where sort of there's a problem in the way that the existing market works, and there's some technical or social solution that's needed. For example, if there's an urgent need to pool sort of medical data across across different organizations or across jurisdictional lines, but there are privacy or security issues involved in doing that, then I think that's an exciting opportunity to sort of solve that problem. But in other cases, it might be less urgent.